Hi, and welcome to the 54th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to cover the Mahdist revolution in the Sudan. The Mahdist revolution will go into our discussion next week about Egypt under British occupation and what that looked like. So the rules, for those of you who are not familiar: this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. But both of us are trying to approach this from a secular perspective to explain the situation for both populations and try and give as unbiased a perspective as possible. That said, because the topic is controversial, like all the topics, we urge everybody to be respectful. But that said, we love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will ask those questions in real time. And what I like to do is I like to say that these classes are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up on the basics, and a 201 meaning that if you know a lot about the topic, we'll probably tell you something you didn't know. We will have a 2-hour hard stop, so at 9 p.m. Eastern time, no matter where we are, that will be the last slide, and we'll just pick up from there when we talk next week. When we put dates below a person, those are typically their years of service, not necessarily their birth or death date, so bear that in mind. And this is a recording, which you can watch later. Like the other 53 entries in this series, this is recorded and you can see them at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to watch these recordings, not just of the Middle Eastern history series, but all the other series we have, from things such as Greco-Roman mythology to the discovery of the Americas. Even though we provide these things to you for free, Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube all cost money, and so we appreciate PayPal donations in order to keep this content coming to you. All right, so welcome to the second half of the episode today. We'll get as far as we can on the Mahdist Revolt. Don't worry, whatever we don't cover, we'll get to next time. And a lot of what we're going to cover today is going to also feed into what we talk about next time. So it works out quite nicely. So what is the Mahdist Revolt? In order to understand that, we need to go back a little bit. So we remember that Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, and he maintained a presence in Egypt until about 1802. While he was there, he created a new sense of nationalism within Egypt and overturned the traditional system of Ottomans who ruled through Egyptian nobility and neo-Mamluks. He raised the consciousness of the local people that they could govern themselves. And when the British forced out Napoleon in the Battle of Alexandria, it created a vacuum for Muhammad Ali to become the new viceroy of Egypt. Now, Muhammad Ali himself was Albanian. He spoke Turkish and Albanian. He did not speak Arabic. And in fact, most of his descendants will not speak Arabic either. And so for this reason, the Egyptian rule of his dynasty, which continues until King Farouk is assassinated in 1952, is often called the Turkish dynasty by many of the Arabs because they spoke Turkish as their dominant language. Now, after he consolidated power, he decided to modernize the country. So Muhammad Ali did a number of things in order to build up the economy. He created a relationship with France, and France started building an école polytechnique, or a polytechnical school in Egypt in order to facilitate the development of a new industrial Egyptian economy. He started giving out concessions to build railroads. He sent students to Europe in order for them to learn. He expanded the cotton production of the country. He redid the national taxation. He started purchasing large ships to rebuild a new navy. He created new systems of irrigation throughout the country in order to promote the development of cotton and other crops. And in doing so, he was able to modernize Egypt. And it wasn't just in terms of these economic developments that he modernized the country. He modernized the country through the creation of a new military, the Geish Nidami, or the systemic army, I guess you could translate it. Now, the Jaysh Nizami was a modern army. In fact, it was an army that was so advanced relative to other Muslim armies that it was able to defeat the Ottoman army repeatedly in combat. We talked about all of this in episode 30, if you want to see it in more detail. And he brought a number of French advisors, especially because of his close relationship with France, to develop this army. You can see, for example, Joseph Antelme, who was a French colonel. He converted to Islam when he lived in Egypt and took on the name Suleiman Pasha al-Faransawi, Suleiman Pasha, the French. And with this new army that he developed, he began to expand his power. Now, we've talked before about his involvement in the Balkans in episode 28 and episode 31. We talked about his involvement in Saudi Arabia in episode 52 in quite a bit of depth. And we talked about in episode 30, his invasion of the Sudan. Sudan is less a country at this point than a set of lands just sort of south of Egypt and west of Ethiopia. Sudan in Arabic literally means black people country. It comes from the word Sud, which is black people. And so it was really, in the mind of the Egyptians, this was the place where blacks came from and the place that blacks had ruled historically. And Sudan itself has a very interesting history distinct from Egypt. And if we remember all the way back to the first episodes in the series, when the Umayyads conquered Egypt, they tried to conquer Sudan as well, which was under the state of MAKURIA. But they were not able to do so. And so they signed what was called the Bakt with MAKURIA, which was one of the longest peace treaties in history. There were some violations, but one of the longest peace treaties in history, lasting from the early 600s until the late 1200s, when the Mamluks began to fight a number of wars against MAKURIA. Because of this peace between Egypt and Sudan, the Sudanese retained the Coptic Church as the dominant Christian faith, as well as a number of animistic faiths, especially in its southern regions, closer on this map to Alodia. Now, the Mamluks begin to change this in the 1200s, fighting deeper and deeper to Sudan and converting more and more of the population. This results in the mid-1500s with the creation of the Sultanate of FUNJ. And you can see the borders of FUNJ. It's roughly analogous to the northeastern quadrant of Sudan today, or probably just the eastern half of Sudan today because of South Sudan's independence. And with the exception of Suakin, which the Ottomans took back, FUNJ was able to control most of its territories, but through a decentralized approach, where the various tribal chieftains maintained control over their local regions. And you began to have the infiltration of Arab tribes among the Sudanese tribes, and a large degree of intermarriage occurred between the Arabs that had moved into the territory and indigenous Sudanese. So when we talk about Arabs in the context of Sudan, we're still talking about people who look black to our eyes. They may be in slightly lighter pigment to the Sudanese because of the Arab admixture, but by and large, these are African groups, despite carrying the name Arabs. For example, the Shukriya, who you can see the cavalry there, Shukriya were known as an Arab tribe. You also have increasingly Muslims beginning to penetrate into this region, and the way that Muslims penetrated into this region was through ulama and through merchants and traders who wanted to bring Islam with them. And so local populations would be converted, but not large-scale populations. So even though the Funj Sultanate was officially a Muslim sultanate, and it was supposed to rule according to the Sharia, numerous Arab commentators from that time argue that it was not applying the law of the Turks, meaning the laws of Islam, right? Because remember, Egypt is controlled by the Ottomans, who are a Turkish group at this time. And SENNAR, under the control of the Funj, is their capital city. It's significantly further south than Khartoum in modern-day Sudan. And SENNAR had a large palace for the Sultan, and there was a mosque as well as numerous local tribal dwellings, which you can see in these images there. A number of African sacral traditions exist within the territory of FUNJ during this time. Things like amulets having magical powers, certain rhythmic dances. In fact, we see this sort of belief in magic persist even today in Sudanese Islam because of the syncretic nature of these kinds of beliefs. Now, FUNJ began to disintegrate bit by bit in the 18th and 19th centuries, such that by the point of 1820, it had really dissolved into all of the constituent entities that it had previously existed as. Remember, the FUNJ Sultanate was a feudal state, and so each of the different regions was ruled by a different tribe or clan. So when the FUNJ Sultanate dissolved, simply those tribes or clans retained the power that they had in the regions that they had already had. When Muhammad Ali Pasha sanctioned the invasion of the Sudan in 1820, he sent his third son, Ismail Kamil Pasha. Unfortunately, there is no picture of Ismail Kamil Pasha, so I used a picture of a different Ismail Pasha. But he led the invasion, and he was known for being particularly brutal. His first interactions were with the Shagea tribesmen, and that's a tribal group in the northern part of Sudan. They resisted quite forcefully under the leader of one of their women, Mohaira, but she was eventually captured, and the Shagea were forced to pay tribute and themselves become soldiers in the army that would attack the rest of Sudan. One of Ismail Kamil's requirements for those that served him was that he would pay 30 piastres, which is sort of like a cent, 30 piastres for every pair of ears that were cut off of rebelling tribespeople. And so he had entire buckets full of ears from these attacked village people. The Shagea themselves proved to be just as violent when moving further south into the area of Kordofan, which is the central area of the Sudan, as well as into the Nuba Mountains, which is the dividing area as you move further west from central Sudan into Darfur region, which is on the west side. Now, these areas were attacked primarily for the acquisition of slaves, and Muhammad Ali Pasha made it very clear that he was going to use the slaves as part of his system to build Egypt. There was no intent on his part to industrialize or incorporate these territories into the modern Egypt he was building, only that he would use their labor. Significantly, he wanted those to be military slaves. He was very worried that the Albanians and Turks that he had drafted into his Jeish Nizami would revolt against him. And so having a slave army would allow him more effective control of the region. That said, the slave trade was notoriously dangerous for the slaves that were taken because of the vast expanses of desert. And significant numbers of Sudanese died in the desert. Other Sudanese died when moved out of Sudan. They couldn't handle the difference in climate. And so there was a high attrition rate among the slaves. Nevertheless, the Egyptians continued their attack in plundering the territory. Another particular goal that Muhammad Ali had was that he had heard the myths of SENNAR, that capital city of the FUNJ, and how beautiful it was, which to say 300 years ago or 200 years ago, those may have been correct. By 1821, when Ismail Kamil took the city, it was a dilapidated ruin. And so Muhammad Ali was disappointed that he couldn't excise gold from the region as well. In most ways, the Turkish Sudan, which is what the territory was called by the Sudanese. They again, remember, Muhammad Ali was a Turkish speaker of Albanian extraction, despite ruling the country of Egypt. And so the Sudanese call this a Turkiya, or the Turkish period. Now, the Egyptians, led by Muhammad Ali, made sure to extract as much wealth as they could from this territory, in fact, behaving very similarly to the European imperialists of the same period. He put the population under an incredibly difficult tax burden and would use violent and repressive means if they did not comply. He also had a vain search for gold in the region. In fact, some small amounts of gold were recovered in the northeastern part of the country, gold that was transported by the rivers, but the Nile and its tributaries. But he figured that there would also be gold in the pyramids. Now, it's worth pointing out that people are familiar with the pyramids in Egypt. They may be less familiar with the pyramids in Sudan, but there are actually more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. They're just smaller. And you can see some of these Meroitic pyramids in the picture above. He smashed a number of them looking for gold, and when he couldn't find it, he decided to turn the areas where he had found some gold into a penal colony. He also extracted significant amounts of ivory and gum arabic. Gum arabic is a very important emulsifier. It helps to keep sugar in beverages and not fall out. Ivory, of course, is self-explanatory in terms of its artistic value. And the power base in Sudan has shifted away from the historic small towns and the city of SENNAR, the capital of FUNJ, into a new city that Muhammad Ali creates, which is the city of Khartoum, at the fork between the Blue and the White Niles. There's a question of, in Sudan's pyramids, are certain historical figures buried there? Absolutely. The Sudanese mirrored the Egyptian custom of burying their leaders in the tombs. In fact, there was a lot of ancient Egyptian cultural influence on Sudan. At that time, it would have been the Nubians and the Kushites. And when the Nubians took over Egypt, that's the 26th dynasty in ancient Egypt, if memory serves. When they took over, they continued their Egyptian practices as the rulers of Egypt. Absolutely, there were mummies in there. There weren't as many riches because most of these graves had already been plundered. Right, it's very rare where you have a situation like Tutankhamun in 1922, where that was the first time in the modern era that tomb had been accessed, and therefore the wealth was still there. Almost all the tombs, certainly all of the pyramids, had been plundered by the time we get to the modern era. So the city of Khartoum really develops, and it blossoms from a city of just a few people into a city of 100,000 by 1885. Now, Khartoum, of course, had these massive slave markets, which coordinated the forcible conscription of significant numbers of Sudanese into the Egyptian military. During the next few decades, after Muhammad Ali dies, we don't really see much involvement from the Egyptian leadership in the day-to-day governance of the Sudan. Probably the closest we get is Said Pasha, who rules from 1854 to 1863, and he presides over the massive growth of Egypt's cotton economy. And that growth is due in large part to the American Civil War, which cuts off Britain and France's primary access to cotton, being the US southern states. Because of this, Egypt is able to fill in the vacuum, and that wealth generation propels Said Pasha to be able to begin the process of massive modernization within the country. However, the Sudanese soldiers were still part and parcel of the Egyptian army, and because of Said Pasha's close relationship with the French, the relationship that his father had nourished, he was critical in sending help to the French-controlled Second Mexican Empire, right? This is when the French invaded Mexico and tried to install their own government there as part of French imperialism. And as you can see, the dates coincide very much with the American Civil War. The Americans, because of their Civil War, were unable to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, where they would prevent European influence in the New World. And so the French took advantage of this in order to invade Mexico. But one of the problems is the area around Veracruz is a very tropical area, and a number of the diseases that were prevalent in that area were ones that the French soldiers could not handle. But it was suspected and believed, although they didn't have the genetic evidence to prove this, that Sudanese could handle this kind of climate. And so Said Pasha consented to send 447 of his Sudanese soldiers to Mexico, where they fought with distinction in the French forces. Many of them could not speak French, and so the Algerian Zouaves, who were Algerian colonial troops brought in by the French, ended up translating between their Arabic and French in order to give them instructions. But the blacks who served, the Sudanese who served in the French military forces were highly respected by both the French who fought with them and saw them, and by their enemies, the Mexicans, who also noted how brave they were. So after Said Pasha dies, he's replaced by Ismail, who takes on the new title of Khedive midway through his administration. That's a title that's bestowed upon him by the Ottoman Empire. You have this weird situation that Ismail is trying to thread, where he's still recognized as subordinate to Constantinople, but he effectively has his own power, and through the Sudan is beginning to create a military empire. He begins the invasion of Darfur in 1875, working with a number of local merchants in the region. And in order to secure this area, he's relying more and more on non-Egyptians to do it. So there are sort of two categories into which these non-Egyptians fall. The first category is of merchants in the region, some of whom are Egyptian, some of whom are Sudanese themselves, who are beginning to amass their own armies and amass their own cultural influence. Probably the most famous of these is Zober Pasha. And Zober Pasha comes from the southern area, what today would be part of South Sudan. And he is a massive slave trader. He buys and sells large quantities of Sudanese slaves, and through that he's able to create his wealth, as well as create his own personal army. That army becomes a key ability, gives him the key ability to negotiate, and he is one of the principal entities responsible for promoting the conquest of Darfur and the subjugation of its inhabitants. On the flip side, you also have Europeans who are increasingly involved in this project. Ismail Pasha appoints numerous Europeans to lead the colonization and occupation of the Sudan. Most famously, there was Charles Gordon. He had his nickname Charles Chinese Gordon because of his work in China to defeat the Taiping Rebellion against overwhelming odds. But in Sudan, he served as the governor, and he tried his best to organize the territory, and bit by bit tried to lessen the slave trade, which had been which the British were very much opposed to. That said, he encountered stiff resistance from individuals like Zober Pasha, who were benefiting quite significantly from that trade. And you also had individuals from other parts of Europe. You have Mehmet Emin and Rudolf von Slatin, who are both Germans, German speakers by heritage. I think Mehmet Emin comes from Germany proper, and Rudolf von Slatin comes from Austria. Both of them had Jewish heritage, but were born as Catholics, and eventually it's unclear whether Mehmet Emin ever converted to Islam. We know that von Slatin did. And they became part of the British administration in the region. And increasingly, more and more of the aspects of how Sudan was run on a day-to-day basis were handled by these foreigners and merchants. But the expansion into Darfur was not sufficient for Ismail. He also wanted to expand into Ethiopia, which brought him into direct conflict with Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia. He fought several battles with him, culminating with the Battle of Fort Gura, which was a decisive Ethiopian victory and meant that Khedive Ismail could not expand into Ethiopia. In particular, this war was a massive financial drain for the Khedive because he threw good money after bad in order to secure it. Right? He got a lot of funding from Europeans. In order to prosecute the war, he was defeated by the Ethiopians. He needed more money to avenge his honor and his prestige, and he lost again to the Ethiopians. In fact, these losses to the Ethiopians were what led to Ismail's subjugation to the British in 1879, and the loss of, he was removed from the throne, and Tawfiq Pasha, who was a British stooge, was put on the throne in his place, cementing the British control over Egypt as a protectorate. And we're going to talk much more about that process next week. So, we get to the Mahdi himself. So the Mahdi is, in Islamic conception, originally a Shiite eschatological concept, which drifts into Sunnism in the latter part of the second millennium. And this concept of the Mahdi meaning the expected one is supposed to be a Muslim who will usher in the time that Jesus will come at the end of days. And Jesus does come at the end of days according to the Islamic conception. It's just that in that conception, he explains that Islam is the one true faith and that he was never supposed to be worshipped as God. The Mahdi, in many respects, bears a strong similarity to the Jewish concept of what Elijah would do before the coming of the Messiah, where he would advise people, or John the Baptist in the Christian tradition, where he advises people that the Messiah is on his way and that they should be ready and await for him. So we have this concept that exists. And so we have to put it in the context of what Sudan is and how Sudan works. So as we mentioned, during the FUNJ period, Sudan had a significant number of animistic traditions. And despite officially converting to Islam, the FUNJ by and large had permitted and even supported many of these African animistic traditions as well as Christianity, which meant that when Islam became more and more common in Sudan during the 19th century, it manifested in the growth of numerous Sufi groups in the region, especially due to Sufis' emphasis on these sort of magical, mystical batin, right? These sort of inner experiences. And so Sudanese Sufis exist in a number of different tariqas or orders, like you can see the Qadariya there. But the order that we care about for this group is Samaniya. The Samaniya are still one of the largest Sufi orders in Sudan. It counts over 1 million members. And these groups preach, trying to understand yourself and your connection to the spiritual. In this group, we find Muhammad Ahmad ibn Abdullah, who you can see there. And he was a Samaniya Sufi, and he began to understand his connection. And from his perspective, the failure of many of the Sufi groups, including the most dominant, the Khatmaniya group, was their subservience to the Egyptian government and their willingness to trade spiritual comfort for material comfort. Right, that they were willing to undergo the kind of oppression, the large-scale taxation, the gold and human excision from the territory in exchange for being left alone by the authorities. And so we end up having Muhammad Ahmad preaching a message against this oppression and in favor of austerity, that the people should abandon this kind of wealth and seek spiritual survival. And in turn, that would lead to political independence. And so he was declared by his followers starting in the 1870s to be the Mahdi, and he assumed the title himself in 1881. And because he became the Mahdi, he began to associate with his own followers. You can see the dervish there that would support him. And I guess we'll talk about the rest of it next week. So questions, comments, concerns as we discuss more about Egypt and Sudan. All right, while we're waiting for those, let me tell you a little bit about our group. We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions, and you can think of us like a CNN, where we have a lot of different programming by different presenters who focus on different aspects of world history. Now, this is, of course, the Middle Eastern Islamic History series that I presented. This is the 54th episode of that. And next week, we are going to talk about the Egyptians and Sudanese in more detail. And the following week, or probably following 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the British mandates of Palestine and Transjordan, as well as the Zionist movement and how that integrates with that history. There is also periodic presentations on the Greco-Roman civilization. Jason Peng hosts a weekly philosophy course on Asian philosophy. Aaron and I once a month do a presentation on European Union security. Once a month, Jane talks about powerful women. We've talked about Wu Zetian. We've talked about Catherine the Great in that series. In the European Union series, we talked about the organization of the European Union as well as its defensive structure. John Maloney has a Dead Languages series. The next in that is Ugaritic on the 29th of October. And then we have several short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War. Our next episode on that is probably going to be in January or February. And we have older series that we've either finished or add to only sporadically. And you can see all of that on our YouTube page, which I encourage everybody to visit. And I'll put those links in the description. I have a question in the chat of what is the modern relationship between Turkey and Sudan like? The relationship is actually rather distant. The modern country of Turkey doesn't really take responsibility for the Egyptian, for Turkish Sudan, because we have to remember Turkish Sudan, while Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, it really was in control of most of its own policy. And in fact, Egypt invaded the Ottoman Empire twice, in the 1830s and in the 1840s. So it was very much the case that the Ottoman Empire had no control in any meaningful sense over what Egypt did. It just had the name that Egypt was still part of the Ottoman Empire because the great powers forced Egypt's hand in this. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Turks strongly distanced themselves from the actions of the Ottoman Empire, seeing themselves as a new country based on the same historical territory and for the same dominant ethnicity, but that the countries have no relation, in the same way that the United States sort of sees itself as separate from the British colonies that preceded it. Now, so the relationship but the relationship between Turkey and Sudan today is generally that the two of them don't really have much in the way to trade with each other. Sudan produces oil, but Turkey has direct access to oil through Azerbaijan, so it doesn't need Sudan. It's more expensive to get oil from that far away. And Sudan doesn't really offer anything. Generally speaking, Sudan has been enmeshed in civil wars and government upheaval since pretty much the 1960s. So there's not really much that Turkey wants from Sudan. So the relations exist, and there's nothing negative in them. There's just nothing positive in them. There's another question here, and Mark, if you're still here, it's directed towards both of us. Where and how do we get the content for our slides? So I can speak for myself. In terms of the images, I know what images I'm looking for. So I've seen many of these paintings or these things before. And so I generally find those on the internet. In terms of the information, there are a number of resources that I have consulted. There are important books like Kingmakers. There are a number of Arabic language sources. This period, as we get into the 20th century, we have lots more documentation than we've had at any other point in my series. And so the difficulty is not actually finding the sources. The difficulty is connecting the dots between the sources, because a lot of times Arab sources and Western sources will disagree on key details. And you have to sort of figure out whether it's because of the perspective difference or whether there's actually an informational asymmetry going on. Mark.
For myself, it's a lot of research on the internet, particularly the French language sources, and also more on the older period, which I'm less familiar with the 1860s and such. I'm much more familiar with the World War II, so a lot of that I just already knew, and it was also like one part of it with the Mer el-Kebir bombardment, for example. I've gone around in Brittany, where a lot of sailors in the French Navy are from, and I've seen the gravestones, and it will say, you know, they died here at Mer El Kebir, and everyone knew what that meant. And so it was something that was quite ingrained in the people, that they knew who had killed them. It wasn't just the Germans, so to speak.
Yeah, I was going to say, and this is something that you and I have talked about privately, is that Brittany is disproportionately represented in the French Navy, and so it's a much stronger cultural memory in Brittany, where the cemeteries are, than you know, anywhere else in France. Not to say that it's not remembered elsewhere in France, but it's specific. It's stronger there, and as Mark reads the French sources, I also read French sources and Arabic sources, and I can stumble my way through some Turkish and some Persian, so and some Hebrew. So I can usually get through most of the major languages of the Middle East, which is helpful in trying to understand what's going on here, and try and put it into context. All right. So I think with that, we'll close out. Thank you, Mark, so much for helping me out with this.
My pleasure.
And we'll see everybody next week. All right, bye.